Hello, my name is Mark Noble, Executive Vice President of Horizons ETFs, and I would like to welcome you to our latest webinar, which will discuss the psychedelic equities industry and the world's first psychedelic-focused ETF, the Horizons Psychedelic Stock Index ETF, which trades under the ticker symbol PSYK, or as we'll refer to it, PSYK. Over the next half hour, we will be joined by Steve Hawkins, President and CEO of Horizons ETFs, to discuss the opportunities associated with psychedelic companies and how PSYK works. Now, Horizons ETFs already has a reputation as being an innovator in the ETF space. Many of you would know that we're the first asset manager in the world to launch a marijuana-focused ETF, the Horizons Marijuana Life Sciences Index ETF, which trades under the ticker HMMJ. And we subsequently have 4 marijuana-focused ETFs. So I think it was probably no surprise that we were looking to launch a product on the psychedelic industry, which has seen absolutely tremendous growth over the last 2 years. Similar to cannabis, the psychedelic industry is currently a Canadian-dominated industry. We like to say that the world is Canada is where the world likes to come and invest in cannabis. It's also where the world is now coming to invest in this exciting new industry. Unlike the cannabis industry, though, however, the drivers of growth within psychedelics are quite different. And so we're going to really talk about that today with Steve. With marijuana, there's always the key potential for investors to capitalize on a larger consumer market, where with this business, it's really more focused on the medical and therapeutic usage of important issues such as mental illnesses, which include drug-resistant depression, addiction, or even post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, we'll get all into that in the webinar, and we'll provide this cursory overlook of some of these developments, as well as how this ETF works. I know we've been getting a lot of questions, so we really want to get into the product details and answer any questions you may have at the end of today's webinar. Before we start with Steve, I wanted to go over a few key items. Number one, if you look to the right of your screen, you'll see that there's a number of PDF handouts that can be opened. Those are all product materials that have some educational materials and product information related to ETFs that we're talking about today. We will also have a Q&A session at the end today. So for live attendees, again, on that same right navigation, you should be able to look at questions. Now, I need to make it clear that there's no guarantee we're going to get to your question on the live webinar, but what we will have is the ability for someone to reach out to live attendees afterwards, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 days, to answer any questions. And of course, if you're listening to us recorded, we are recording this webinar, you can always feel free to send us a question directly to Horizons. We love hearing from you and love hearing feedback about our products. As a final point, neither Steve or myself have any professional opinion on the underlying companies held by PSYK. When we talk about companies, we're purely talking about what they're doing from an educational perspective. We also need to make it very clear that we are not advocating the use of psychedelics for their therapeutic usage. That's an entirely different topic altogether. We're simply focused on the investment opportunity as it relates to PSYK and the broader investment industry. So while we get started, I'd like to first introduce Steve Hawkins, our CEO and Chief Executive Officer. Steve is responsible for the day-to-day business affairs of our firm. He has more than 30 years experience in the investment industry and has been with Horizons ETFs for more than 12 years, first as a CIO and prior to becoming our CEO in 2015. And of course, many of you know that he's definitely one of the true innovators in our industry, launching the first family of actively managed ETFs in Canada, the world's first marijuana ETF, the world's first AI ETF, a true innovator. Steve was also recognized as the CEO of the year at the 2018 Wealth Professional Awards, and he's currently the chairman of the Canadian ETF Association. So just bringing a wealth of knowledge on how ETFs work, and this has been obviously a passion project for him. On the agenda today, we're going to look at psychedelics. What are they? We're going to talk about the industry opportunity for psychedelics. We're going to, of course, talk about their ETF PSYK, its methodology, and some of the key constituents. So I'm going to pass it over to Steve. Steve, thanks for being here today. I know we have a lot of attendees that are really excited to hear about PSYK today.
Yeah, most ever attendees that we've ever had for a webinar. And Mark, thanks for hosting, and let's have some fun. Let's talk psychedelics.
So first, let's start, with the question very clearly. I mean, psychedelics, I think a lot of people probably on the webinar don't really actually know what they are. Could you give us a little bit of a sense of what are psychedelics? And when we're talking about psychedelics, what are we referring to?
So we're actually not talking about the underlying drug itself. We're talking that, our psychedelics is really about the companies themselves that are creating these novel and new therapies with respect to various types of illnesses that you mentioned earlier, primarily in the mental health, in addiction, depression, PTSD, all these types of therapies. So it's psychedelic stocks that are generating or developing these different molecule drug therapies, going through rigors of drug testing for the purposes of creating drug therapies for the treatment of these various illnesses and diseases.
And when we look at where this is going. I mean, how we look at this, particularly we look at something like versus cannabis, for example. I mean, are there key differences here? What are these companies doing from a very broad level? Someone asks us, what are these psychedelic companies doing? What are they studying?
Well, I mean, a lot of this is a genesis around what's going on with this industry and where did this industry come from a psychedelics perspective, and that really goes back to in the past several decades, there hasn't been a lot of therapeutic advancement with respect to PTSD and depression, clinical depression, and all of these types of things. Over the past couple of decades, a number of very, very well-known institutions like Johns Hopkins, Yale, NYU have all been doing these great studies, which have shown had great results, which show that there are very strong therapeutic possibilities from psychedelics themselves. And to your question, that this is really a drug industry. This is not a recreational industry. So there are some parts of it that is recreational. I mean, and you get a state like Oregon where everything is legal and you can go out and buy LSD on the corner store if you want to and use it. But this is not what psychedelic companies are really focused on. They're focused on developing new molecular drug therapies for the purposes of treating illness. Things that you can buy over the counter or through your doctor, prescriptions. They're going through the rigors of the full Health Canada and FDA approval process, full clinical testing of all of these different types of therapies. And that's really the big difference between cannabis, because the cannabis opportunity was really started with recreational, and this opportunity with psychedelics is really from the biopharmaceutical perspective.
We don't necessarily think that these companies are out there having warehouses full of mushrooms, right? Where we do see that with the marijuana business, where we talk about greenhouses and supply. This is a research and development industry.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, I'm sure that you can find those warehouses full of mushrooms out there. They are, and there is, one of the companies in the portfolio does, grow mushrooms specifically so that they can harvest the stems and use those for recreational mushroom therapy. And so that's an interesting side note, which is being sold in Netherlands and to some degree in Canada. But again, this is really about the biopharmaceutical therapeutic drug possibilities for these different drugs. Here we have listed on the, just some of the things, magic mushrooms is really the key word out there, psilocybin, and we have a company in the portfolio that is, developing synthetic psilocybin. Something that we saw early on in the cannabis industry was companies that were creating synthetic THC and synthetic CBD. And why are we as a creator of an ETF that's investing in this industry, investing in these fake drugs kind of thing? But for us, it's really all drug therapy, and whether it's psilocybin or synthetic psilocybin, it's all really at the end of the day for the same therapeutic possible treatments. But LSD, as everybody know, and there's been some great studies of late on microdosing of LSD, and it's really about the treatment that LSD can be used for the purposes of addictions and dementia and headaches. Psilocybin is really the sort of the key for depression and clinical depression. Mdma, which is not listed here, but that is really, there's been a number of studies with respect to the treatment of PTSD, and that's one of the main studies that came out of Johns Hopkins over the last decade or so. And you have ketamine, and ketamine is now being used more and more out there. I mean, J&J is one of the investee companies in us, and the largest drug company in the world has a ketamine based nasal spray for the treatment of depression. So that's very, very something. But again, it's interesting to know that a molecule like that really came out of development from a Canadian psychedelics company and ended up in the J&J repertoire of drugs that are availability that they're out there. And DMT, this is really for the purposes of treating addictions and strokes and things like that. So there's a lot of different types of psychedelics, and this is not an exhaustive list. There's many more to come from that as well.
And I think it's worth noting, right, that a lot of the treatments there, these drugs are being used from a clinical basis, right, where it's not just the drugs that are being studied. These are clinical trials with therapists, doctors looking at ways to effectively bring in the doses, look at ways to work with patients in terms of finding possibly a breakthrough, which I think works really well in this nice slide, possibly a breakthrough on what is a large global issue, which is mental illnesses across the world. These numbers are quite staggering. I think a lot of people don't realize how profound mental illnesses impact, just the general framework and health of the world.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the head on the nail on the head right there, because it's not just about going to the pharmacy and getting microdoses of psilocybin or LSD and then taking it home and taking it yourself. I mean, that's ultimately, I think that might be the end goal here, but there's a lot of testing rigors that are going to have to go into this. Right now with the use of psilocybin, you're talking about therapy, mental therapy from a licensed clinician before and after. But one of the big differences here between the psychedelics themselves and cannabis, as an example, is cannabinoids really need to work together from a multiple molecules perspective to get you the end result and for whatever treatment that it is you're looking for. And depression is one of those as well. And all of these things are really for the purposes of moving away from opioids, which have been are hugely addictive. In the past, there are LSD has been addictive and things like that. But the really great thing about the possibility of psychedelics is you can have a single molecule working by itself, which can basically provide long-term effects. So it's not like a drug that you need to take every day or things like that. I mean, that's really what the end goal here is. They've had people that have been cured by psilocybin doses for up to 6 months of depression, and something to you're over 700 million people suffering from some sort of mental illness. The fact that you can create a drug that can treat something that has had zero advancement in the past 20 years from a treatment perspective, like clinical depression, as an example, the huge market opportunity for these potential drug therapies, like we have on here, is like over $50 billion from a global scale. And drug companies themselves are, in aggregate, I mean, drug companies themselves are really going to want to get in on the space, like we've seen J&J, like we've seen AbbVie with these ketamine-based drugs. And, we think it's only a basis of time that the smaller psychedelic companies, which are doing all the research and the funding for the clinical trials and stuff, will ultimately be, selling these different molecules and even the delivery mechanisms of these molecules into these big drug companies to, at the end result, for you and I to get a drug approved that we can use under our drug plan and buy, and your company health plan will pay for your prescription for you to get your microdosing of LSDs. It should be very, very interesting to see what happens in the future there.
So on this next slide, Steve, I mean, we've talked about the really big, large numbers, right? 2.5 trillion funding mental illnesses globally. 1 out of 4 people globally suffering from some mental illness. That can almost be overwhelming looking at, what kind of numbers we're looking at from a business opportunity. But when we pare it down specifically, initially, if I'm looking at these companies as an investor, where's the immediate kind of business disruption that we could see in the next couple of years, where these companies come in and actually start to, carve a niche in some lucrative areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think depression is probably the primary target that's going to happen at first, and that's where a lot of the clinical trials are really, really focused, and psilocybin especially. with all the different, there's, got to be at least 30 public companies right now that are in some form of psilocybin clinical testing for the purposes of treatment of depression or clinical depression. But it's not just the drug therapy itself or the molecules themselves, it's also the delivery mechanism and how does the overall therapeutic process work and the experience of the patient who is using the drug. So it's, how much do they have to meet with their psychotherapist before they're allowed to use the drug? How long do they have to be with the therapist while they're getting taking the psilocybin drug or taking the microdosing of LSD? And then how long do they have to spend with the therapist after to see what the after effects are and things like that? I mean, it is a very, very long process at this point. And a lot of these companies are working on the refinement of that process so that, it is much quicker, much simpler, much easier for the end person to get to the results that they're looking for. But depression is, and right now, because of COVID and what's happened in the 2020, which is a very, very strange year for everybody, and we really want to put it behind us. Mental illness has really come to the forefront of the world on an overall basis, and being able to treat mental illness right now is something that everybody is talking about, because there are so many cases and issues around the world, and a lot of that has resulted from.
Do you have some numbers, though, Steve? Like, how big is this market?
Well, again, I mean, we're talking here, on the slide. I mean, we've got 320 million people around the world from a general depression perspective. You got major depression of 200 million, and then you have this sort of group of individuals that have been resistant to depression therapies in the past, which is almost 1/3 of those. But basically 1 in 5 people out there is suffering from some sort of mental illness. And this is where we get into the really big numbers of from a global scale and the possibilities from a treatment perspective that are out there.
And I think people probably don't remember, but I mean, the last time there was any sort of breakthrough drugs for the treatment of depression were the SSRI drugs of the 1990s. So if you remember, like Prozac and Paxil. My understanding is this is kind of the only frontier right now where there's real money being used to find new pharmaceutical treatments.
Absolutely, and that's why we're very, very excited to be, have created this ETF, which helps invest into this sector and helps provide funding to these companies doing all of this very critical drug testing, which we see is very, very important for the future from a global health and mental wellness perspective.
Okay, so this one always surprises me. Another big question we get from investors is, why are Johnson & Johnson and AbbVie, which are two extraordinarily well-known pharmaceutical giants, what are they doing in this portfolio? I want the pure play. I want the mushroom companies, right? They say. But I think there's some important reasons we have some of these large giants in the portfolio. They're not huge weights, but if you could provide some insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of this goes back to when we created HMMJ, and this industry is still very, very young. There's still a lot to happen from a maturity perspective, and we still need some substance in the portfolio from a drug company perspective. We do have a limit on big pharma in this fund directly, but it has to be companies that are operating with some psychedelics in their lineup, either from that are approved and being able to be bought in the marketplace, or are very advanced in the drug testing possibilities of the psychedelics. Johnson & Johnson, as I mentioned, have a ketamine drug which is available out there, the nasal spray Spravato. But then AbbVie, which has been very, very active in their own ketamine-based molecule testing. They've had some slowdowns in the drug approval process, but it's also something that we expect to happen in the near future. Both of these companies are very committed to this space and building out in this space, and that's why they're both in this portfolio. There are another number of other drug companies, big pharmaceutical companies out there, like all the ones we're hearing about from the COVID vaccines with Pfizer and Moderna and things like that, but they're not active in the pharmaceutical space for psychedelics, and that's why J&J and AbbVie are, is because they are. But until they're not a pure play from that perspective.
And then here, of course, are some of the more pure play companies. Could you give us some sense of what it is exactly we'd be looking at in terms of, what some of these companies do? Like what, again, just maybe a little more deep dive. We know they're doing research and development on treatments, but specifically, what are these individual companies, some of these larger names doing in the portfolio?
Well, I mean, you have a company like Cybin, which is a Toronto-based company, so near and dear to our hearts here in Ontario, which is a biopharmaceutical company and is doing great advancements in psilocybin, different variations of psilocybin molecules. Was actually one of the originators of, one of the molecules which has ultimately gone to Johnson & Johnson, which was help with their ketamine spray. But Cybin is also very, very active in the delivery mechanisms for these different drug therapies. So they're not only are they doing their own drug therapies, and they've got so many different molecules in sort of advanced stages of various different development and testing. We're very, very supportive of a company like Cybin, which is going many, many different routes in this space, and almost sort of like we would treat a multi-state operator in the cannabis space in the US from a soup to nuts perspective. Cybin is sort of doing it all. You got a company like MindMed, which is a US based company, but listed in Canada from a stock exchange perspective, but very, very focused on microdosing of LSD, treatment of PTSD. But this is one of the largest pure play companies in the portfolio now, but it's a US company, which has come to the Canadian capital markets, very much like these are the similarities to the cannabis sector back from the 2016s and 2017s, where the US companies have to come to Canada to play in the capital markets in this space. Then you get a company like Compass. We had GW Pharma, which was a UK-based pharmaceutical company in the marijuana portfolio. Now we have Compass, which is a UK-based pharmaceutical company in the psychedelic space. Again, something very, very comparable from a psych to an HMMJ kind of portfolio, but very, very active in the synthesized psilocybin, as I mentioned earlier, and something that we see is, they're doing great advancements with their own drug testing in this space, and we would treat them as one of the also pure play companies. And right now, the portfolio is really made up of about 90% of these types of pure play companies that are really working actively with psychedelic drug therapies themselves, relative to the big pharma like the J&J and the AbbVies we talked about, which make up about 10% of the portfolio.
Okay. Well, really helpful in terms of understanding the liquidity sleeve, as well as the fact that we're giving clients this pure play exposure that they're probably looking for more than the big names. Moving to the ETF itself, we've successfully raised already $60 million in a very short period of time, about a week and a half. I guess the question I'm asking is someone who works at Horizons, why didn't we do this sooner?
Well, the market itself for psychedelic stocks is still very early stage. And, when we launched HMMJ, we only had 15 companies in the portfolio. And one of those was Scott's Miracle-Gro, a giant company in the US, very much like we have J&J and AbbVie in this portfolio here. We only have a handful of companies that really met sort of a liquidity and size requirements that we need to be able to actively trade to be able to create an index or a portfolio to give you that broad diversified exposure to this underlying sector, which is going to mature very, very quickly from here, we believe. But it's still, again, we love being first to marketplace with new and innovative sectors like this, the new psychedelics, like we did with marijuana back in 2017. But to do so, we have to sort of go into the marketplace with open eyes, try and find all of the, there's no index providers out there that are going out there and, you don't have S&P saying, well, these are all our psychedelic companies that we can use. We've got to do all of the legwork ourselves. We're the ones that are very, very active in the marketplace ourselves, trying to figure out which companies are really, really active in the psychedelic space, and doing more and more activities. And again, for us to have to build a portfolio, we really had to wait until we had enough size. And last year, with Cybin and Mdma both doing sort of an RTO and an IPO on the Neo Stock Exchange, which is where PSYK is listed, it really provided us the opportunity to create a more rounded, diversified portfolio. And so we were, even though we've been actively watching the space for, all of 2020, it wasn't really until the end of 2020 that we felt that there was sufficient depth to the marketplace in psychedelic stocks for us to create an ETF like PSYK.
And one other point on that too, Steve, which I think is really important, because I know we have a fair amount of people from, across the globe based on some of the questions I'm seeing. I mean, this is also a very uniquely Canadian sector, right? And the majority of these are in the Canadian marketplace, and that's sort of where our expertise is dealing with, the marijuana space, which is primarily Canadian. We have this expertise in the Canadian capital markets to kind of build a liquid solution that can trade on those platforms.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this in the introduction. I mean, like Canada was the place to come if you wanted to invest in cannabis companies early on in 2016, 2017, as that sector started to very, very quickly mature from there. And same right now with respect to psychedelics. I mean, there's federal approval for drug testing at many, many different levels here on all of the different types of psychedelic drugs. And our capital markets are a little bit more, I would say, forward-looking with respect to investing in young, new, exciting sectors which have great potential impact on society, like the psychedelics industry itself. And so people are coming to Canada. Like I said, MindMed as an example is a company listed in Canada. It's not listed in the U.S. right now, even though it's a U.S. company. And we've seen that with all of the U.S. marijuana companies which have come to Canada, and we've seen that with the psychedelic companies which are really building out operations and coming to Canada from a capital markets investment perspective.
I think that leads us nicely into our next slide, Steve, in terms of the methodology. Obviously, a lot of words on here. We don't have to go through it all, but I think, the first question that we get asked is why, you touched on a little bit, but why are we running this as an index rather than, actively picking some of these names? We get asked that a lot, even about HMJ.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that we've really found out, through the course of launching HMJ is people who want to invest in this sector are really excited about investing in this sector, want to know that they're investing into psychedelic companies. They don't want somebody actively managing a portfolio and from time to time it's holding a big cash position or it's being overweight individual names on a relative basis. We never know what's going to happen next in this marketplace. And when you own a passive index product, which is 100% invested into this sector in some way, shape, or form at all times, and people can see the list of the companies that are there, people have something that they can talk about, it's tangible, they know what's going on, they know generally what they're invested in. There isn't anybody behind the scenes making discretionary decisions. Well, I don't like this company, so I don't want to invest in. I mean, we saw this came front and center a couple of weeks ago when GW Pharmaceuticals, which was one of the big names in the HMJ portfolio, which really hasn't been in any of the other active marijuana company portfolios, there was a big takeover. We saw Afria and Tilray enter into their purchase discussions. And we see that transaction happen. And if you weren't invested in Tilray because you thought it was overvalued, you are not participating in that upside. And we saw, HMMJ's performance go up huge because of that.
Those were two stocks that I think most active managers were had on sell lists right across the board. And you get a big move on them, right? Because that's what happens with most big moves in the market you can't anticipate. So the index is giving you that sector exposure.
For sure. And what the one big takeaway here out of doing this from an index perspective is we created this index to adapt, evolve, and mature as the industry itself matures. I mean, with the underlying HMMJ index, in the past 4 years since we launched that ETF or that index, at least, the index itself has changed 8 times from an underlying strategy perspective. We've built the psychedelics index so that it will evolve and change as there's more companies out there and things like that. Like ultimately down the road, we see the number of companies in this portfolio growing dramatically. I mean, we've already seen 2 new RTOs happen in 2021 in this space, and we have a rebalancing coming up in March, but the index is going to be adapting to potentially add new names along the way and throughout the year of 2021.
In terms of lessons from HMMJ, because we're running at one point $1 billion, we're close to $1 billion again, and running that portfolio. What were some? You mentioned the Fast Admiral. Were there any other lessons that we've learned running these index strategies? Some best practices?
Yeah, I mean, it was really about how to ensure that the underlying portfolio continues to diversify into the sector place. The minimum market caps that we're using now, which are pretty low on a relative basis, will grow. The minimum price per share for the companies will grow. The amount of activity in the psychedelic space is that's really the key discretionary item, and it's we're really trying to be focused more on pure plays. So as there are more and more pure play psychedelic companies out there, the fact that we have big pharma in this portfolio will actually probably reduce simply because there are more pure play psychedelic companies out there. And the ketamine based drug for J&J is very, very immaterial. Like Scott's Miracle-Gro eventually has a significantly reduced exposure in HMMJ now, whereas at the start it was pretty high from a weight perspective. Here we limited the drug big pharma companies, and we really want to focus on the pure play psychedelic companies.
And we have the whole list of names of these stocks that we have in the portfolio, which are derived from the index, as we mentioned. Any key highlights here outside of some of the big names we talked about, or anything else you want to add in terms of what we have in the portfolio?
No, I mean, this is the portfolio basically as we see it right now. Numinous is a great company. We believe is operating. But the big key point that you want to take away, and to your point earlier, Mark, is look at where the companies are based. This is a really Canadian-focused industry at this point in time, and we expect it to really stay that way going forward. I mean, MindMed is actually operating. It says here Canada, but it's actually operating in the U.S. But it's listed here in Canada. Right. And that's where we really see the capital markets activity. But all of these companies, really, this is a really Canadian new sector for magic mushrooms, we'll call it. And it's a Canadian-based idea, and that's why it was very, very important for us as a Canadian ETF company to bring the world's first psychedelics ETF to the marketplace as well.
And I've seen some questions already pop up on the screen, about how different will this portfolio look, in 6 to 9 months. I think we've built in the flexibility that, this is not going to necessarily be the holdings or the weights that we see even in 1 month, 3 months, or even a year from now.
Absolutely. I mean, when we launched, we had 17 names in the portfolio. I'm going to expect, by the end of Q2, that there could be at least 25 different names in the portfolio, and by the end of this year, there could be probably close to 40, 50 names, maybe
50 names.
Marketplace. This sector is growing fast. A lot of these companies have already come to the marketplace, have already started raising money, are already doing private placements, are already thinking about RTOs and IPOs, and it's just a matter of size that really. And then once they get to sort of a sufficient capital market size for us to really, really consider, but we've got 100 different names on our watch list right now that are very, very active in this space from a pure play perspective, and that's why, again, this really sort of akins itself to the early stages of the cannabis sector. We had 100 plus names on our watch list, but we were only invested in the teens from an initial perspective. Here, we see this industry growing very, very rapidly. We see a lot of investment coming into this sector, and we're here to help support that from an investment perspective.
And that really segues nice into this last slide, which you see, one of the key things there being diversification. If you've got 50 to 100 names chasing, a fairly narrow segment, they're not all going to be winners, right? We've seen that with cannabis, which I think is one of the key advantages of using an ETF.
Absolutely, it is the diversified risk of owning an ETF, not putting all of your eggs in one basket with respect to one or two specific cannabis names. I mean, when we launched HMMJ, people say, well, I'm just going to buy Canopy, or I'm just going to buy Afria or Aurora. You know, and at certain times they were going up, and at certain times they were going down. But the ETF was pretty steady all along, and you know, it takes a weighted value approach and increase in performance to that whole basket. And that's why that diversified exposure of an ETF is very, very important when you're especially investing in the early stages of an industry like this. And you know, we're not saying you should be putting all of your ETF money into PSYK, because that is really not the right way to do your own personal investings and manage your investings. But to the extent that you are investing in new and exciting sectors, if you want to take a portion of the portfolio from an alternative investments perspective, themes like psychedelic stocks is something we believe that people should be investing in. You know, it's almost ESG related as well, because this is for the wellness of a society on a going forward basis. The global impact that psychedelic drugs could have from a therapeutic perspective is so extremely important to our society right now that you know, it's almost better than, from my perspective, than reducing carbon emissions and things like that. The potential shorter term impact on society that psychedelics could have is that important to us generally. But going back to why the ETF, you know, this is a pure play for the most part beta project. We're going to be investing in the companies. We're going to be investing in new companies as they get added to the sector. And when you are investing in PSYK, you know what you're investing in. We list the holdings on a weekly basis on our website. You know, and you can learn more and more about the psychedelics industry basically by coming to our website, looking at these companies, understanding what the ETF is doing, how the ETF is evolving, changing its holdings, and it reacts to the marketplace. And there's so many possibilities down the road for big pharma to come into this place, take out companies. You know, these things are going to happen down the road. Different molecules are going to be, you know, they're going to get to their phase 3 testing, and big pharma is going to be stepping in and taking out these companies. But the one other big thing, the one other big benefit here, Mark, about owning this ETF really is income. And none of these companies that are in this portfolio, and sorry, I took your question away from you.
That's
but
fine.
you know, none of these companies that are really in this portfolio are paying dividends. You know, because this is a Canadian ETF, and under securities rules here, we are able to lend the underlying securities. And there's a lot of capital markets activities in these underlying securities. And when we lend up to 50% of the underlying portfolio, we're generating a significant amount of income. Effectively, we're paying you to own this ETF, because the income that we're generating is significantly more than the management fee, the annual management fee for the ETF. And at the end, we're generating a nice yield for you. In the early stages of HMMJ, we were paying 10, 15% annualized distribution to the unit holders. I don't think it's going to be that much for the psych, but it's going to be a substantial amount. And this is almost like owning a covered call on this industry, because we're giving you that cushion of that probably somewhere between 4 and 7% yield that we're going to be able to generate on this underlying portfolio and distribute to you. And that's after your fees that you're paying through us, through the ownership of the ETF. So owning this space has, and through the ETF, is very, very significant to you. And when you own the individual securities themselves, you're not getting any of that potential securities lending revenue that your broker custodian who's holding your stock for you is. When you hold the ETF, you are.
Perfect. This is a great place, I think, to move to Q&A, Steve. You know, we did have disclaimers up there. Steve and I are obviously really excited about this sector, and we wouldn't launch an ETF if we weren't. But of course, you know, I would urge you to take a look at some of the research that's going out there, looking at the fact that there is a higher risk-reward trade-off with a sector like this. You know, we're looking at a 50 to 100 stocks chasing a very lucrative business that's to disrupt pharmaceuticals on mental illness treatment, but at the same token, they're not all going to be successful. So, you know, when you're looking at these new emerging sectors, you do have to keep that risk in mind and realize that, you know, this is our view, and we're excited about it, but not necessarily everything comes to fruition. We hope it does.
Very excited about it. Very excited.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are, as we've mentioned a number of times, excited about this ETF. We've excited at the response we've received already, and we're going to continue, to drive forward with ETF innovation like this. And particularly, we're excited to see how Psych evolves as this industry hits new milestones. So if we didn't answer your question today, notice the contact details below. We are social. You can reach us on social media with any questions, or you can reach us directly at info@horizonsetfs.com. Our customer service representatives are going to be quite busy answering the questions we didn't get to today, but that's exciting for us as well to reach out and hopefully get contact with some of your questions. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day and continued success on your investment journey. Thanks again, Steve.
Have fun, everybody.